If you ever feel like something is wrong, even when everyone tells you it's fine, you're probably right. That was what went through my mind the moment the nurse slipped the note into my hand and walked away like nothing had happened. It was such a small thing, so quick I almost thought I imagined it. 1 second she was adjusting the blanket over my husband's legs, the next her fingers brushed mine, leaving behind a folded piece of paper no bigger than a receipt. She didn't look at me. Didn't smile. Just turned and left the room with quiet, practiced steps. I stood there beside the hospital bed, the steady hum of machines filling the silence, my husband resting with his leg elevated in a cast that was supposed to be simple, routine, nothing to worry about. A broken bone, they had said. A clean break. A few weeks of recovery. That was all. And yet, nothing about that moment felt simple anymore. I kept my face still, careful, the way you do when you don't want anyone to see your thoughts forming. My son was by the window, scrolling through his phone, his posture relaxed but distant. My daughter-in-law stood near the door, arms crossed, watching the hallway as if she was waiting for someone. No one noticed the paper in my hand. Or if they did, they didn't say a word. Slowly I unfolded it. 2 seconds. Maybe 3. Just enough time for my eyes to focus on the handwriting. 3 words. Check the camera. That was it. No explanation. No signature. Just those 3 words, written in a way that felt rushed but deliberate. I read it again, just to be sure I hadn't misunderstood. Check the camera. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Hospitals are busy places. People make mistakes. Notes get mixed up. But something deep inside me, something quiet and steady, refused to let it go. Because the nurse hadn't looked confused. She hadn't hesitated. She had made a choice. I folded the note again and slipped it into my coat pocket, my fingers colder than they should have been. Around me, everything continued as normal. The soft beeping. The muted conversations in the hallway. My son laughing quietly at something on his screen. My daughter-in-law turning back into the room, her expression smoothing into that polite, practiced smile she always wore. Around me. They said he should be discharged in a few days, she said lightly, as if we were discussing something as ordinary as a grocery list. I nodded just once. Calm. Measured. The way I had learned to be over the years. But inside something had shifted. Because I had lived long enough to recognize when a moment didn't belong. When something didn't fit. And those 3 words, tucked away in my pocket, felt like the beginning of something I wasn't supposed to see. Not yet. But I would. I always did. I did not check the camera that day, and that was the part one kept replaying in my mind later, the quiet decision to wait, to observe, to not move too quickly, because over the years I had learned that the truth rarely reveals itself to those who rush toward it, it unfolds for those who stay still long enough to notice the patterns, and something about the way my daughter-in-law stood near the door, glancing at her phone every few minutes. Then at the hallway, then back at my husband, felt like part of a pattern I had not yet understood, while my son remained distant in a way that was new, not cold exactly, but careful, like he was choosing his words before he spoke them, like there were conversations happening somewhere that I was not included in, and that feeling, that quiet exclusion, settled over me more heavily than anything the nurse had written on that small piece of paper. Later that evening, when visiting hours ended and the room grew quieter, I noticed how quickly Sophie stepped in to handle everything, speaking to the nurse about medications, asking questions I had not yet thought to ask, positioning herself between me and the details in a way that might have seemed helpful to anyone else, but to me, it felt like a door being gently but firmly closed, and when I tried to step closer, to ask about the discharge plan, she answered before the nurse could, her voice smooth, controlled, almost rehearsed, saying that everything had already been discussed and there was no need to worry, which only made me more aware that there was something to worry about. I watched her carefully then, not openly, not in a way that would draw attention, but the way you watch someone when you are trying to understand what they are not saying, and I noticed the small things, the way her smile faded the moment she turned away, the way she lowered her voice when speaking to staff, the way she placed her hand on my son's arm when I asked a question, as if reminding him of something without using words, and he would fall quiet again, nodding along, agreeing without really engaging. And it was that silence that unsettled me more than anything else, because my son had never been a quiet man. Not with me, not in all the years I had known him, until now. That night, after I returned home, the house felt larger than it should have, the kind of quiet that presses in from all sides, and I found myself standing in the kitchen long after I had set down my keys, my coat still on, my mind replaying the day in fragments, the note, the nurse's expression, the way Sophie had taken control of every conversation, and the way Daniel had let her, and I reached into my pocket and unfolded the paper. Again, smoothing it out against the counter under the soft yellow light, reading those 3 words over and over until they no longer felt like a suggestion, but a warning, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that whatever was happening did not start at the hospital, that it had been building quietly, piece by piece, in moments I had dismissed, in conversations I had not fully heard. And as I stood there, alone in that quiet kitchen, I realized that if I wanted to understand what was really going on, I would have to stop trusting what I was being told, and start paying attention to what I was not. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, before the rush of visitors, before the hallway filled with voices and footsteps, because I wanted to see things as they were when no one expected to be watched, and the building felt different at that hour, quieter, almost honest, the fluorescent lights softer, the nurses moving with purpose instead of performance, and I kept my pace slow, measured. The way I had learned to move when I did not want to draw attention, my coat folded neatly over my arm, my expression calm, as if I were simply another wife coming to check on her husband, nothing more, nothing less. When I stepped into his room, Daniel was not there, which in itself was unusual because he had insisted the day before that he would be staying overnight, and Sophie stood by the window, speaking in a low voice on her phone, her back turned to the door, her posture tense in a way she usually hid well, and she ended the call the moment she noticed me. Her smile appearing just a second too late, like it had been placed there rather than felt, and I greeted her the same way I always did, with politeness, with restraint, giving her no reason to think anything had changed, because that was the key, I reminded myself. Nothing could change on the surface, not yet. My husband stirred slightly, his eyes opening just enough to recognize me, and I took his hand gently, noting the warmth, the steadiness. The way he did not look like a man who needed to be kept under such careful supervision, and that thought stayed with me as Sophie began explaining, again, the plan for his care, her words flowing easily, too easily, as if she had repeated them more than once, as if she had practiced them, and I listened, nodding where appropriate, asking small questions that sounded harmless but were not, questions about timing, about procedures, about who had authorized certain decisions, and each answer she gave seemed complete on its own. But when placed together, they did not quite align, like pieces of a puzzle that almost fit but not entirely. After a few minutes she excused herself, saying she needed to speak with someone at the front desk, and I watched her leave, her steps quick, purposeful, and the moment the door closed behind her, the room felt different, lighter somehow, and I stood there for a second, listening to the silence, before turning my attention to the hallway outside, where a small, dark dome sat quietly in the corner of the ceiling, angled just enough to capture everything that passed beneath it, and I felt my heartbeat slow, not quicken, because clarity does that. It steadies you, it sharpens your focus, and without rushing, without hesitation, I stepped out of the room and into the corridor, my eyes lifting briefly to that camera, not in a way that would seem obvious, just a glance, the kind anyone might make without thinking, and then I continued walking, following the path Sophie had taken, not because I wanted to confront her, but because I wanted to see where she went when she thought no one was paying attention, and as I moved through the quiet hallway, I understood something with a certainty that settled deep in my chest. Whatever the truth was, it was already in motion. And all I had to do now was watch it unfold. I did not call out her name when I saw where she went, and that restraint mattered more than anything in that moment, because the truth does not reveal itself to those who interrupt it, it reveals itself to those who allow it to continue, and so I slowed my steps just enough to keep distance between us, turning the corner a few seconds after she did, my eyes scanning the hallway with quiet intention. Until I saw her standing near a nurse's station that was not assigned to my husband's floor. Her posture slightly angled away from the main corridor, as if she had chosen that spot for a reason, and she was not alone. A man in a dark blazer stood across from her, not dressed like a doctor, not wearing any visible badge, just holding a folder tucked under his arm while listening closely to what she was saying, and though I could not hear the words, I did not need to, because the way she leaned in, the way her voice dropped, the way her hand moved subtly as she spoke, all of it told me. This was not a casual conversation. I remained where I was, half concealed by the corner, my expression neutral, my breathing steady, because I had learned long ago that the most important details are never spoken loudly, they live in the spaces between gestures, in the way people position themselves when they think no one is watching, and as I observed them, I noticed how the man nodded slowly, opening the folder just enough for her to glance inside, her eyes scanning something on the page. Before she gave a small, decisive nod, and then, almost as quickly as it had begun, the exchange ended. He closed the folder, said something brief, and walked away in the opposite direction without looking back, while Sophie remained there for a moment, her shoulders relaxing slightly, her face returning to that familiar, composed expression before she turned and began walking back toward the room. I stepped away from the corner then, moving in the opposite direction as if I had been headed somewhere else all along, giving her no indication that I had seen anything at all, and as we passed each other in the hallway, she offered me a polite smile, the same one she always used, warm on the surface, empty underneath, and I returned it with equal calm, because this was not the moment to react, not the moment to question, not the moment to reveal that the pieces were beginning to shift into place. Instead, I continued walking until I reached the end of the corridor, where another camera sat quietly above a set of double doors, its lens fixed, unwavering, capturing everything without judgment, without interference, and I stood there for a second longer than necessary, just enough to understand what the nurse had meant, because it was not just about watching, it was about knowing where to look, knowing when something ordinary was not ordinary at all, and as I turned back toward my husband's room, I realized that whatever Sophie was doing, it involved more than just conversations behind closed doors, it involved records, documentation, something official enough to require a folder. Something important enough to keep hidden in plain sight, and for the first time since I read that note, I no longer felt uncertain. I felt certain of one thing. I was no longer walking into this blindly, and neither was she aware that I had begun to see. When I returned to the room, everything appeared exactly as I had left it, and that was what made it feel different, because once you begin to see, you cannot unsee, and the ordinary becomes something else entirely, something layered, something deliberate, and Sophie was already back at her place near the window, her posture composed, her attention focused on my husband as if she had never stepped away at all. And Daniel had returned as well, standing beside the bed, speaking in a low voice. That stopped the moment I entered, replaced by a brief, almost rehearsed update about a call he had taken, something about work, something unimportant, and I listened, nodding gently, allowing the conversation to move past me without resistance, because resistance would have drawn attention, and attention was the one thing I could not afford yet. I took my seat beside the bed and reached for my husband's hand again, feeling the same steady warmth, the same quiet presence that had always grounded me, and I spoke to him softly, asking how he felt, whether he had slept well, keeping my voice even, familiar, while my eyes moved occasionally toward the hallway, toward the direction of the cameras I had noticed, mapping them in my mind, one after another, until I understood the path they covered, the angles they held, the blind spots they might leave, and as that understanding settled in, so did a decision, one that came without urgency, without panic, just a calm, steady clarity. Later that afternoon, when Sophie suggested she and Daniel step out to get coffee, insisting I should stay and rest, I agreed without hesitation, even offering a small smile as they left, because sometimes the easiest way to be underestimated is to appear cooperative, and the moment the door closed behind them, I stood, not quickly, not nervously, but with the same quiet purpose that had guided me since I first read that note, and I walked out into the hallway, my steps measured, my expression neutral, until I reached the nurse's station, where a young man sat reviewing something on a screen. His posture relaxed, his attention focused, and I waited until he looked up. Meeting my gaze with polite curiosity, before I spoke, my tone gentle, almost hesitant, as if I were asking something small, something easily granted, I told him I had misplaced an item earlier, something of no real value, but I believed I might have dropped it in the hallway near my husband's room, and I wondered if there was any way to check the cameras, just briefly, just to be sure, and he hesitated, just for a second. The way people do when they are weighing rules against reason before offering a careful explanation about privacy, about protocol, about how such requests were not usually accommodated, and I listened, nodding, thanking him for explaining, turning slightly as if I were ready to leave, and then I paused, just enough to let the silence stretch, just enough to let the moment settle, before I added, quietly, that I understood completely, and that I would not insist, but that I had spoken earlier with a nurse who seemed concerned, and she had suggested I check, just in case, and I watched as something shifted in his expression, subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of recognition, of uncertainty, and that was all I needed, because doubt, once introduced, has a way of opening doors that were previously closed, and after a moment, he glanced at the screen, then back at me, and said that perhaps there was a limited way to review a small section, just to confirm whether anything had been left behind, nothing more than that, and I nodded, my voice soft, appreciative, while inside, everything had already begun to align, because this was no longer about a lost item, and we both knew it. He did not say anything at first, and that silence told me more than any explanation could have, because people who are certain of the rules tend to repeat them, but people who are unsure begin to bend them quietly, and as he turned the screen slightly toward me, I stepped closer without hesitation, keeping my expression calm, almost apologetic, as if I were still concerned about nothing more than a misplaced belonging. And the footage began to move, grainy but clear enough, a timestamp in the corner marking the hours I had just lived through, and I watched as the hallway appeared exactly as I remembered it, the steady flow of nurses, the occasional visitor, the quiet rhythm of a place that runs on routine, until it did not, until a familiar figure entered the frame, Sophie, walking with that same purposeful stride I had followed earlier, her head slightly lowered, her attention fixed ahead. And I felt something inside me settle, not shock, not surprise, but confirmation. The footage continued, and there she was again, stopping near the nurse's station that was not ours, turning just enough for the camera to capture the angle of her face, her expression no longer softened by politeness, no longer composed for an audience, but focused, intent, the way people look when they believe they are alone, and seconds later, the man in the dark blazer stepped into view, approaching her without hesitation, without introduction, as if this meeting had been arranged long before I ever walked into that hospital, and I watched the way he handed her the folder, not openly, not carelessly, but with a small, deliberate motion that suggested familiarity, and she took it with the same quiet confidence, opening it just enough to scan what was inside, her eyes moving quickly, efficiently, before she gave that same nod I had seen with my own eyes, the kind of nod that signals agreement, not confusion. I did not speak, did not react. Because this was not the moment for emotion, this was the moment for understanding, and as the footage continued, I noticed something else, something smaller but no less important, the way Sophie's hand moved briefly toward her bag, retrieving something that the camera could not fully capture, just a slight shift, a subtle exchange, but enough to suggest that whatever this was, it was not a simple conversation, it was a transaction, one that required privacy, timing, and intention. The young man beside me cleared his throat softly, as if unsure whether he should continue, and I turned to him then, offering a small, grateful smile, the kind that reassures without revealing, and I told him that was enough, that I appreciated his help, that I must have simply misplaced my item elsewhere, and he nodded, relieved perhaps, turning the screen back toward himself as if the moment had passed, as if nothing of importance had been uncovered, and I stepped away, my movements steady, unhurried, because the truth, once seen, does not need to be chased, it only needs to be carried carefully. As I walked back toward my husband's room, I reached into my pocket, feeling the folded paper still there, no longer just a warning, but a confirmation, and I understood now that whatever Sophie had been planning, it was already in motion, already documented, already real, and the only question left was not whether something was wrong, but how far it had gone, and how much of it had been happening right in front of me all along. When I stepped back into the room, nothing had changed on the surface, and yet everything had already changed for me, because once you understand that something is being hidden, every word begins to carry weight, every silence becomes intentional, and Sophie looked up from her phone with that same composed expression, asking if everything was all right in a tone that sounded caring but felt measured, and I nodded gently, taking my seat beside the bed as if nothing at all had shifted, because the most important part of seeing the truth is not reacting to it too soon. My husband opened his eyes again, clearer this time, more present, and I leaned closer, speaking softly, asking how he felt, and he answered with a small frown, saying he was tired, more tired than he expected for something so simple, and that detail stayed with me. Not as a question, but as another piece, because fatigue can come from many things, but it can also be prolonged, managed, extended, depending on what someone decides is necessary, and I glanced briefly towards Sophie, who stepped in quickly, explaining that recovery can vary, that rest was important, that the doctors were being cautious, her words smooth, practiced, the same tone she had used before, and I listened without interruption, because I no longer needed to challenge what she said. I only needed to remember it. Later, when Daniel returned from another brief absence, I watched the way he avoided looking directly at me, the way his attention shifted towards Sophie before he answered any question, as if waiting for confirmation, and it was then that something deeper settled into place, something quieter than anger, more precise than suspicion, the realization that this was not new, that whatever arrangement I had seen on that camera had not begun today. It had simply reached a point where it could no longer remain invisible. I thought back to the past few months, to small moments I had dismissed at the time, conversations about paperwork that had been handled without me, changes in accounts that had been explained quickly and then forgotten, decisions made during family dinners that had seemed rushed but reasonable, and now, looking at them through a different lens, they no longer felt separate, they felt connected. Like steps in a sequence I had not realized I was part of. Sophie moved again, adjusting something near the bed, her presence constant, attentive, almost protective, but not in the way one protects a loved one, in the way one manages a situation, and that difference, once understood, could not be ignored, and as I sat there, my hand resting lightly over my husband's, I made a decision that did not require urgency, did not require confrontation, only patience, because whatever they believed, whatever they had planned, depended on one thing, that I would continue to trust what I was being shown instead of what I was beginning to see, and that was the one thing I could no longer offer. I looked at Sophie then, meeting her eyes with the same calm expression she expected, offering a small, almost grateful smile, the kind that reassures, the kind that lowers defenses, and she returned it without hesitation. Unaware that the balance had shifted, unaware that I was no longer standing outside of what was happening, but quietly, carefully, stepping into it, one piece at a time. The next day, I did not change my routine, and that was the most important part, because when people believe they are in control, they stop looking for signs that they are not, and I arrived at the hospital at the same time, greeted the same nurses, took the same seat beside my husband's bed, my voice steady, my movements familiar, giving nothing away except what they expected to see, and Sophie responded in kind. Her attention divided between her phone and the room, her presence constant but never fully present, while Daniel drifted in and out, his conversations brief, his eyes avoiding mine more often than not, and I allowed it all to continue, because interruption would only slow what was already unfolding. I waited until the moment presented itself naturally, the way it always does when you are patient enough, and it came when a nurse entered the room to check on my husband. Not the same nurse who had given me the note, but someone older, more experienced, her movements efficient, her tone direct, and I watched as she reviewed the chart, her brow tightening slightly for just a second before she smoothed it out, the kind of reaction most people would miss, but I did not, and when Sophie stepped out to take a call, I followed the opportunity without hesitation, leaning in slightly, lowering my voice, asking a simple question about the expected recovery timeline, nothing unusual, nothing alarming. And the nurse answered, but not in the way Sophie had, her explanation shorter, more grounded, suggesting that my husband's condition was stable, that there was no immediate reason for extended monitoring beyond a standard observation period, and that difference, small as it seemed, confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, that the version of events I was being given had been adjusted, expanded, reshaped to serve a purpose I had not yet fully uncovered. I thanked her quietly, offering a small, appreciative smile, and as she turned to leave, I added one more question, softer this time, almost hesitant, asking if there had been any changes to his paperwork recently, any updates or authorizations I might have missed, and she paused, just briefly, her eyes shifting toward the chart again before she answered carefully, saying that all documents appeared to be in order though some had been processed quickly, and that if I had concerns, I should speak directly with administration, and that was all she said, but it was enough, because speed, in a place like this, is rarely accidental, it is requested, approved, expedited by someone who knows exactly what they are doing. When Sophie returned, her expression calm, her voice light, she resumed her place without question, unaware that the ground beneath her had already begun to shift, unaware that every word she had spoken was now being measured against something real, something verifiable, and I met her gaze with the same quiet composure she had come to expect from me, offering no resistance, no suspicion, only agreement, because the most effective way to understand a plan is to let it continue just long enough to reveal itself completely. And as I sat there beside my husband, my hand resting gently over his, I realized that I did not need to confront anything yet. I did not need to accuse, I only needed to let them believe that nothing had changed, because the moment they felt safe, the moment they believed they had succeeded, that would be the moment everything they had tried to hide would become impossible to deny. It happened the following afternoon, not with a confrontation, not with raised voices or sudden accusations, but with something much quieter, much more final, because by then I understood that the truth does not need to be forced into the light, it only needs to be placed where it cannot be ignored, and I had already made the necessary calls that morning, calm, deliberate. Speaking with someone in administration who listened more carefully than they spoke, someone who understood that certain questions, when asked the right way, require proper answers, and so when Sophie and Daniel stood at the foot of the bed discussing discharge plans that still did not quite align with what I had been told, the room felt different, not tense, not yet, but waiting, as if something had already been set into motion beyond their control. A knock came at the door, soft but firm, and a man stepped inside, dressed professionally, carrying a folder that looked very much like the one I had seen before. Only this time there was no attempt to hide it, no effort to keep the exchange quiet, and he introduced himself clearly, his voice steady, addressing all of us at once, explaining that there were some documents that required clarification before any further decisions could be made, and I watched as Sophie's expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for someone who did not know her to notice, but I did, the slight tightening around her eyes. The way her posture shifted just enough to signal that something was no longer going according to plan. Daniel looked between them, confused, asking what this was about, and the man responded calmly, opening the folder, referencing recent authorizations, expedited approvals, and procedural inconsistencies that required review, his tone professional, factual, leaving no room for interpretation, and I remained seated beside my husband, my hand resting lightly over his, my expression composed, because this was not a moment for triumph. It was a moment for clarity. Sophie attempted to respond, her voice measured, offering explanations. That sounded practiced but no longer held the same weight, because once something is questioned openly, it loses the protection of silence, and the man listened without interruption, then turned slightly, indicating that there was also recorded footage that would need to be considered, and that was the moment everything shifted completely, because words can be shaped, adjusted, softened, but evidence remains exactly as it is. And Sophie knew it. I saw it in the way her composure faltered for just a fraction of a second before she recovered, but it was enough. Daniel's confusion deepened, his gaze moving from her to me, searching for something, an answer, a reaction, and I met his eyes calmly, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a quiet certainty that did not need to be explained, because this was not about proving anything anymore, it was about allowing the truth to stand on its own. The room grew still. As the man continued, outlining the next steps, the need for review, the importance of accuracy in matters that carried legal and medical weight, and Sophie said nothing further, her silence speaking louder than anything she could have added, and as I sat there, listening, watching, I realized that the moment I had been waiting for had already passed, not when the evidence was mentioned, not when the questions were raised, but the moment I chose to see instead of ignore, because from that point on, everything else had simply followed its natural course, and for the first time since this began, I felt no uncertainty at all, only the steady, quiet understanding that whatever had been hidden was no longer mine to uncover, it was theirs to answer for.